Welcome to Pulpcast, the official podcast of thepulpmedia.com. In this podcast, we discuss everything in pulp culture, from comic books to movies and video games. This week, we bring you an interview with Ed Brisson, the creator behind The Violent at Image Comics. All right, so when did you start reading comics? Were you a kid? Were you a teenager? When was the first issue that you can remember?
I started reading comics as a kid. I don't remember exactly what the first issue was that I picked up, but my mom was always a big reader, and so weekends were often spent in used bookstores. And so I would sort of dive into the used comic section. I can't remember what my allowance was back then, but it was maybe like $1 or $2 a week. And the used comic book bin at the used bookstore had a bunch of like 25-cent comics, so I could get a bunch for what my allowance was. I think some of the first stuff I read, and probably when I was like maybe 6 or 7, I think I might have started reading comics. The first three things I can remember reading were Captain Canuck, which is a Canadian superhero comic, Peter Porker, the Spectacular Spider-Ham, and I remember reading Sectors, which was like a licensed tie-in, which was not very good, but I remember reading that roughly at around the same time, although that might have been a little bit later. But yeah, since childhood, since about the time I could read, and I did drop off for a little bit when I was sort of college age. That was more of a financial issue than anything else, and then picked up a bit again a couple years later.
Awesome. So what about them interested you? Was it the mixture of art and words, or was it just like a particular story that like really got you excited about them?
Yeah, it was mostly art and words working together. Like I started reading at a pretty young age, and like by the time I guess I was in grade 4, I was reading stuff like Stephen King, stuff that like probably kids in grade 4 shouldn't be reading.
Yeah, that's kind of intense.
It's exactly why I was reading it, because I shouldn't have been. But yeah, I really like drawing a lot. I liked art a lot, and so just having those two things together was pretty great. And when I was in elementary school, a lot of my friends read comics, so it wasn't a thing that was strange for a kid to pick up and start reading comics. They were still fairly popular back then. We're talking, this is like early 80s. And yeah, I loved both writing and drawing when I was a kid. So yeah, it was one thing where I could do both.
Awesome. And did you do any stories where you like wrote them and drew them like at that age, or was that something that you kind of got into later on?
No, I did when I was younger. I always liked writing a whole lot. But growing up, I never really considered that I would be a comic book writer. My goal was always to be a comic book artist. And I remember like when I was younger, when I was probably 11, my friends and I would put together like these sort of storybook / comic type things. And then later on, when I moved cross country, my old friend back in Oshawa, where I'm from, he and I used to do these sort of by-mail jam comics where we would each draw a page, and then we'd send it to the next send it back and forth, and the other person would add on another page, and then that went on for a couple of years. We used to do that, but nothing really super serious when I was younger. Like I said, I mostly just wanted to draw comics, so I spent most of my time drawing, and somehow, for some reason, when I was younger, I really segmented my writing and my drawing. They were like two separate things. So I would draw comics, and usually I would kind of redraw comics I liked or what have you. But when I was writing, I was mostly just writing like short stories. When I was a kid, I wrote a lot of like what would be called fanfic now, but wasn't back then. There wasn't really a term for it. It was just me writing. I loved horror films, so I would write a ton of stories about like Freddy Krueger and Mike Myers and Jason Voorhees and Cujo. For some reason, I was obsessed with Cujo when I was younger. And but that would always be kind of separate from my drawing. I would draw, like I said. based on comics that were already out there.
Awesome. So it was just kind of something to cut your teeth and kind of figure it out before you started telling your own stories?
Yeah, I think so. I never really, like, even growing up, I never really thought that I would be a comic book writer. Like, even my old high school yearbooks, it talks about how I kept saying I want to be a comic book artist. But what happened is, when I was trying to really get into it, there was no internet back then. There was no way of meeting people who wrote. So I actually only started writing comics out of necessity, only because I didn't know any writers. And it was originally under the assumption that eventually, I might get hired by a publisher to draw, and they would pair me up with a writer. But yeah, and that's how it was for years. I went to university, I went to fine arts to learn better how to draw, and never really had an inclination to write. Like, again, just sort of writing out of necessity so I would have scripts to work from. And then eventually hit a point, and it took a long time. It took about 15 years before I hit a point where I realized I actually really didn't like drawing. I think I like the idea of being a comic book artist more than I liked putting in the work to be a comic book artist. But I really, really enjoyed writing. And so at a certain point, I just kind of switched over and decided, okay, I'm just going to write. I'm not going to worry about drawing. And that's sort of when things started coming together for me.
And then how did you get involved with comic book lettering? Because it sounds like you're kind of skilled in all sectors of comic book making.
Yeah, well, that was as I mentioned earlier, I went to fine arts, and then I just had like Joe jobs for the longest time. I worked at a bookstore for years, video stores, movie theaters, and I decided I want to go back to school to get some sort of like practical training I could use for work, and so I ended up going to school for a publishing program where I learned basically how to put together books and magazines and edit and do all that sort of stuff. And that sort of gave me the skills to know how to learn how to letter, because there's a lot of pre-production work involved with lettering. And so I had sort of all that knowledge. And at that point, I'd been sort of writing and drawing and self-publishing comics for a long time, which I'd lettered them, going back to the 90s, where I would paste up, unfortunately using Comic Sans, I would paste up, on artwork. But then eventually just learned Illustrator quite well and InDesign quite well. And it just happened, it's just one of those things where I just happened upon a manga company that was hiring, and a friend of mine had been working for them and mentioned they were hiring. And I did a test, which I screwed up royally. I'd never read manga. I was always just like a North American comics reader.
Right.
So I screwed up that test pretty badly that they gave me. But they must have been pretty desperate for work, because they hired me anyway. And that was 10 years ago. And so I was lettering manga for the longest time. And then I just started branching out and doing other, like, the pitches for people and stuff like that, and a lot of indie books. And then it just eventually, through doing that long enough, I just started landing bigger and bigger gigs. And just, that's how I broke through into comics, I guess, as a letterer, which is never something I never would have seen coming before that. And I'd always been trying to get into comics as a writer, and had been pitching before I ever started lettering. But yeah, it's just I have the background, like the pre-press knowledge, to do a lot of the work that comes with lettering, and just happened to, luck into some jobs that just led to more jobs. And, 10 years later, here I am.
Awesome. So you've done a lot, like you letter all your own stuff, and then you've lettered like Shutter by Joe Keating and Rat Queens and that kind of stuff now. Do you find that there's a difference between doing it for yourself and doing it for others, like for clients, I guess? I mean, they're collaborators, but...
Yeah, I would say, there's a huge difference for me in that when I letter projects that I've written, I tend to use the lettering stage as a chance to sort of massage text and dialogue in the writing. Often I'll drop some dialogue if I feel like the art conveys the story, and we don't need the text. And oftentimes I'll just rewrite dialogue as I'm sitting down to letter it, try and tighten it up, or make it work with the artwork, if you know what I mean. Like it's so that, just kind of making it feel more natural and match the art more. So I do use it, like I said, as almost like a final draft of my script when I'm lettering. And then when I'm lettering for other people, obviously I'm not tweaking their dialogue or anything like that. So it's more just like a production based job to make it sound really cold. But it's just basically just doing what's in the script and making it work for them on the page.
Awesome. That's really cool that you use it as like a part in your creative process for yourself.
Yeah, it's what I'm used to. So it's always when I do work for other publishers where they're bringing in their own letters, it always kind of freaks me out a little bit because I don't have that final pass that I do when I'm doing my own. So it stresses me out a bit more when I'm writing the scripts because I don't want to provide extra work for the letterer, because I've been in their position and I know how much it sucks when a writer comes back and rewrites a bunch of stuff after they've already lettered it.
Awesome. So speaking of working on jobs for other companies that's not creator owned, you wrote a few issues for Batman and Robin Eternal by DC. Could you talk a little bit about that experience and collaborating with so many other people on it?
Yeah, that one was really interesting. So I got the call, I guess, last May-ish, and I was pretty excited because I really do like the idea of a sort of a writer's room environment for writing stuff. I think ultimately, like I enjoy just being by myself in a closed room writing. But I do like the idea of being in a room with a bunch of other writers and being able to throw ideas back and forth and try things out, and having people who are bringing a ton of experience to the table, sort of vet the ideas. And it's a really good way for like testing ideas too, to see how much your ideas can stand up to their scrutiny, because they're going to rip them apart if there's any sort of chink in the armor. But it was a really cool process. I got to go down to the DC offices and work out of there with the other writers. I got to write Batman, which is pretty awesome. Yeah, it was a cool process. It was a huge story, so it was a lot of stuff for us to talk through and work out. And every so often we get a curveball that we'd have to sit down and just try and make it make sense and make it fit into the story. And working on that sort of weekly schedule where everybody is, even though the books are coming out one week after the other, we're all basically writing at the same time. So we really needed to know where the person before and the person after us sort of was, to make sure that everything hopefully flowed really smoothly. But yeah, it was a great experience, and hopefully not my last there. And I'd do it again in a second.
Did you find that you were kind of more worried of making the writing match up? Or because were you writing for one artist, or were there multiple artists on an issue for that one?
It depended on the issue, but it was both. Like some issues, it was one artist throughout, and some we would have multiple artists. A couple of the issues I wrote there were two different timelines going on, so there was one artist on each timeline, which just like from a production standpoint, where you've got to get these things out weekly and cannot miss a deadline. That made a lot of sense. But there was, the editors, it was like Chris Conroy, Dave, I cannot say his last name, starts with W. We had Rebecca Taylor and Mark Doyle. They were all really good at making sure that everything, worked together. And, we spent, the writers and ourselves, there's email chains that go a million emails deep back and forth, and we did spend, you know, boatloads of time in a room, you know, in a closed room with each other. So I think by the time we walked out of there, we all were pretty much on the same page. So I don't recall any like massive hiccups that came out of it. You know, every so often there would be like, you know, a logic thing that we'd all somehow overlooked. They were usually small and usually easy to deal with when they came up.
Awesome. So you've done a lot of work through Image. You've done a lot of creator-owned books. The one that we're going to focus on today is The Violent. So what is that story? How do you explain it to those who've never heard of it before?
I'm a terrible pitch man. But it's a crime story set here in Vancouver where I live. One thing about Vancouver is that there's not usually stuff set here, but we're always like the stand-in for other cities in film. You know, there's so much stuff that's filmed up here, so people are familiar with Vancouver, but they probably think that it's New York or Portland or Seattle or whatever it's standing in for at that point. But it's a story about two ex-drug addicts who have a kid together and have sort of cleaned up because, you know, they want to raise their kid and they're trying to get on the straight. And, you know, shit doesn't go the way that they necessarily want it. It's not necessarily easy to get over addiction and just be done with it. There's a reason why the recidivism rate on drug addiction is so high. And also like a factor and something that's happening in Vancouver right now, and a large part of the reason that I'm moving away from Vancouver this summer is that people like Becky and Mason, the main two characters in the story, they maybe have high school education and their job prospects are not great. You know, in the book, Mason works as a swamper for a moving company, which is basically he's a mover, and Becky cleans offices after hours. So they would be sort of lower income range. And what's happening in the city right now is because the real estate has gone so crazy, fewer people are buying and staying in the rental market, which has increased the demand on the rental market. So people in their sort of income bracket are essentially being pushed out of the city. So it's about them trying to survive in a city that doesn't seem to want them, while they're also trying to battle their own personal demons with, you know, their child sort of stuck in the middle and trying to do everything to sort of serve that and failing miserably. And this is literally the worst elevator pitch, I think, for this. Essentially, there he is, the Vancouver crime story.
Well, there you go.
But,
I feel like that
yeah.
that encompassed a lot of it because you got the character element, you got the kind of like setting, which is definitely a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted Vancouver to really seem like this, like sort of ominous presence throughout the whole series, which hopefully is the case.
How did you pair up with your collaborator, Adam Gorham?
I've known Adam for years. He's a good friend of Michael Walsh, who I worked on a book Comeback with, which is the first Image book that I did. And I guess like I've known Michael Walsh since 2010. And so I've been, you know, I go to Toronto, where he's based in Hamilton, just outside of Toronto, at least once a year, and we usually hang out. And I must have met Adam probably in 2010, 2011 at the very latest, because, you know, they were always hanging out, so we'd always end up hanging out. So we've been talking for a while, and I'd kind of just been keeping an eye on Adam's art and just kind of waiting for the right project to come up that I thought that, you know, he might work on. And this just happened to be it. You know, it's like about 5 years after we met, but you know, eventually this thing came along, and I hit Adam up to see. I sort of pitched him the story, and he was down for it. So, you know, unfortunately, it's not a super interesting story there.
Oh, that's totally fine. I imagine that's how most of these artist collaborations happen. Is just over time you get to know them.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So what do you want to do with this story? Do you want it to kind of like expose parts of the city? Do you want it to inform, like you mentioned, addiction? Is there something there you want to kind of let people know?
Yeah. Well, like I'm trying to, like, the real main thing for me is that it's almost a real cathartic experience writing this, because it's addressing a lot of my own problems with Vancouver at the moment. And actually, since we started this series, a lot of stuff about the Vancouver real estate market has started to sort of come to light. Things that people had suspected for years is sort of finally being revealed, even though like sort of the Vancouver Real Estate Board had been denying it for years.
Right.
Has come out. So it's been kind of an interesting time to be doing a book like this. But for me, it's just really the story of like, even though like a lot of those Vancouver elements play a big part, it's really the story of two parents just trying to do right, and how they sort of cope with their own failings. Both Adam and I are parents, so we kind of, you do go through this sort of fear that you're fucking up, like all the time with your kid. It's a real big worry. And so I wanted to just sort of like, a lot of this book is like my own fears about being a parent. Obviously, like, I don't have a drug addiction problem, but I have seen the fallout from drug addiction in people I've known through the years. So I'm trying to really address that issue. It doesn't. I wish I had gone into, but there was not really a place for it in the story, like the war on drugs and the sort of negative fallout that it has, and how much it's just an absolute and utter failure, and is something that doesn't make any sense anymore. Why we're sort of continuing this war on drugs the same way that we are, rather than trying to take different approaches to dealing with drug addiction and and the consequences of drug use.
There's a really cool TED Talk about the nature of drug addiction. Have you seen it? It's from this British guy, and I guess he like toured all over the world talking to drug addicts and like why they can't really come clean. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you seen it?
I don't know, but I've never watched a TED Talk in my life.
Oh man.
I know that they're great. I keep hearing. But was it Johann Hari? Was that the guy?
That sounds familiar.
Because he has a book. Yeah, that's a British writer.
Guy. Yeah,
he wrote Chasing the Scream.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, because that book is amazing. If anyone, here I actually can see his TED Talk right here. That book is incredible for anybody who is interested in why the war on drugs is such a failure, and how much it actually costs, both physically and financially, and how there are just so many better ways, and not like theoretical ways, but proven approaches that we can take to addressing the issue in much more sustainable and effective ways. But I constantly pushing that book on people.
Yeah, the TED Talk's really good. I think it's like kind of a really quick summation of what his research found, but it's so good. You should take some time to watch it if you're such a huge fan of the book. Highly recommended.
I will do that for sure.
So what I love about The Violent is how realistic it is. Like Mason and Becky, although I can't really relate to their situation, I'm not a parent, I'm also not a drug addict, but it seems like these are people that you come in contact as you're walking down the street, or even like wherever you buy groceries or whatever. What kind of development has gone into the characters to make them seem so realistic?
Like part of them is just, it's just from life, like people I've seen and stuff. So like I've known people who've had similar issues or gone through similar problems, not the same as what happens in the book, but who've struggled with addiction of one sort or another. And I find that a lot of times in popular media anyway, they're portrayed more as like characters rather than people. and I really wanted to sort of make the whole thing seem as real as possible, so that we could just relate. Because it is a pretty depressing story. It's not a super happy story, and that's only going to work if you can really relate
Yeah.
to the characters. And I think when I tend to write, I try and make characters as, you know, real seeming as possible. I don't like that sort of like that stereotypical, just sort of like two-dimensional comic character. And I don't think anyone tries to write a two-dimensional character, but it's just like I want to make sure that, you know, when I'm writing people, that they seem as well-rounded as possible, and that I'm doing some service to them and to the story, for, you know, for the sake of the reader and for the sake of myself, so that I can feel proud of it when I'm done.
Cool. Well, it definitely shines through because I mean, I've read all of them, but right after the first issue, I was like, these people, like, they seem like people I've interacted with before, and then I'm like really affected by their story. I finished the first issue and I got really sad and I had to go find something to do to cheer up, and then it just like keeps doing that every issue. And I think, like you said, it's because they're relatable and they're realistic and they're not these kind of fake, realistic kind of individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and honestly, I guess like I tend to write pretty, you know, pretty dark stories. I think that, and that's the kind of stuff that kind of tends to bring me in, you know, and so that's just where I tend to gravitate towards. But yeah, I just, again, I just wanted it to resonate with people.
And so a lot of the other stuff that you like, there is a lot of violence besides the actual kind of like drug addiction kind of stuff. Did you have to have a lot of conversations with Adam to kind of draw the line, or is there no line with what's going to happen in the book?
In terms of violence?
Yeah, or just like the kind of depth of content. Are you going to go, you know, is there a line where you stop and say like, this is as far as we're going to go? Or is it just like a matter of time before you delve into those depths?
Yeah, I don't know. I think there are like moments where we have like sort of scenes where it could possibly sort of go off the rails, and I think take away from what the story is. And like, I don't want to, like, I'm not a huge fan of, like I was saying earlier, I was a huge horror film fan growing up, but like I'm not a huge gore fan, right? Like I feel that like when you start showing, you know, just violence for the sake of violence, or in horror films, gore for the sake of gore, it just takes away it has no meaning anymore. And I prefer stories that rely more on the tension and what the character is going through. So for us, I don't think there's been any moment where we were worried we were going to go too far. There's a scene involving a dog, where we could have, like, it easily could have, I guess, gone off the rails. But we didn't really show, we just implied rather than showed what happens.
Yeah, that's the one I'm specifically thinking of with this question.
And I think that works better, because if we'd shown, then, you know, it would have been about that moment, right? Like, it would have been about the gore, or how gross it would have been. And I think that it's almost more, in some ways, it's more horrific when you don't see it. There's a movie, which is maybe not the best example of this, but there's a movie from the 80s called Henry, the Portrait of a Serial Killer. And there's a just terrifying scene in there where it's about, if people don't know, it's got Michael Rooker in it. And him and a friend basically go on this sort of they're serial killers who go on this kind of killing spree. There's one scene in particular where they go after a family in the family's house, and they have a video camera that they're playing around with, and they point it at the family, and you know that they're about to kill the family. And what happens is they move out of frame, and you see the family living room, and you can just kind of hear what's happening. And that is so much more terrifying than if you'd seen what was happening. And I always try and think about that, like, because I think that if they'd shown them killing a family, that's a pretty brutal thing, and it almost would have ruined the film. And instead they went the other direction, and they made the scene in a lot of ways so much more terrifying, and sort of saved the film in a lot of ways. And I think doing, writing things like The Violent, we gotta just sort of pull back sometimes. And even with that dog scene in particular, you're not even hearing anything. It's just, it's just implied what had happened. So in a lot of ways, it's more terrifying to let the reader sort of fill in the blanks. And I realize I'm making it sound like this horrible book where a lot of bad stuff happens, which is not my intention here. But hopefully that answers. We like I said, that was the only one I can remember where we really had a conversation where we sort of pulled back and didn't show what had happened, but just implied it. Yeah. But honestly, there was no real reason that we would have needed to show it. Like, just implying it was enough.
Yeah, I think the point that you make is really interesting, that like gore for gore's sake, just it really cheapens the experience. Not just the experience, but like it almost makes it seem like it's lazy.
It is. It's 100% lazy. It's just, and it's like, I'm not a fan of things like, Saw,
right,
or those sort of like almost like torture porn style horror films, because there's nothing really
artistic about it.
Yeah, nothing. It's just like, how mean can we be to these characters? How like physically cruel can we be to them? And I sort of hate that that kind of stuff. And like, if you go back and you look at like the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre film, which is like probably one of the most horrifying films I've ever seen, so much of the stuff I didn't realize this until I went back and watched it. Some of the stuff that's the most horrific scenes happen off screen. You don't actually see them happening, but it's just implied that they're happening. And I think that was sort of the brilliance of that film, and really, it unnerves you even more.
So issue 4 comes out the end of this month.
Yes.
And then I assume the first trade collects the first 5 issues or 6? How long is this arc?
That's right. The first 5 issues.
Okay. So what can you tease for readers who have been, caught up thus far for what's going to happen at the end of the first arc?
I can't say too much right at the moment. I guess the one thing I can kind of say is that The Violent will actually wrap at Image with issue 5.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the sales just weren't, I guess, just strong enough to keep it going, which is too bad. But that said, Adam and I are working on a second arc right now, and we don't know what that's going to be. We've been floating around some ideas. There's a possibility that we might do it at another publisher. It may not be called The Violent. So really just, people keep an eye out for Adam and I doing a second crime series together. But it is, we're working on a story called Running with the Devil, which is actually set in the mid-'80s in Kelowna, which is coincidentally the city I'm moving to, where I also used to live back in the late 80s through most of the 90s. And it's about, it's a story about 3 kids who run away from home they're pretty young, and there are different motivations for running away from home. And they run into, they have a bad run-in with a drug dealer, and it's sort of also, the story itself deals with a lot of the satanic panic style stuff that was going on back in the 80s, which anyone around my age will remember pretty vividly, the idea that there were always satanic cults just somehow on the edge of town who were kidnapping and killing babies or children. which all obviously was not true. But it's something that we're playing around with. So it almost sounds like it's going to be a horror movie or something like that. It will basically be kind of a straight sort of crime thing, but mostly about kids trying to survive in the world. And the kids are also sort of going through their own things at home that sort of prompted the runaway in the first place.
Cool. That sounds great. Sounds like a good follow-up to it.
Hopefully, like I said, we'll see how that's actually going to come around. But yeah,
that's too bad that sales aren't being sustained well enough.
Yeah, I think right now it's a weird time in the industry. I think that Image has been running on a high for a while, and I think that you're starting to see some of the some numbers are starting to settle a little bit,
right,
from what they were. And unfortunately, that just means that some books are probably going to be cut earlier. And the sales on it right now are they're sustainable, but I think that that the approach is to try and get out while the sales are still sustainable rather than letting them dip.
Yeah,
if that makes sense. And so it's unfortunate, but the two of us are going to the whole creative team, hopefully we're all going to just sort of persevere, and we're looking at our options for getting it out. We've had a couple discussions, so it looks pretty positive that it's still going to continue, but will likely continue in a slightly different form and possibly with a different title.
Awesome. Cool. Well, to wrap up, usually we do some kind of goofy questions just to kind of get off the vein of comics and just have some kind of weird stuff. So I always like to ask creators when you walk into a buffet, what's the first food item that you go for?
Oh, you know what? We just did this the other day. My whole family, we're all vegetarian. So anytime that we go to a buffet is usually like a crapshoot for us. So it all depends on what kind of buffet. Is it just you talking a regular North American sort of style buffet? Whatever
it is, it has everything on the menu.
Okay, because we actually had Indian buffet last night.
Ooh, yeah, those are good.
And I actually always go for salad first. I usually fill my plate up with salad and eat a big salad first before going back and getting other stuff. But at the buffet last night, I can tell you exactly what I had. I had basmati rice, sag paneer, an egg curry that they have, and the cauliflower potato dish that I'm completely forgetting the name of right now. Pakoras, and for some reason they had spring rolls there as well, which I had weird. A few of. But yeah, that's normally if it's a Chinese buffet, then I'm always going for the chow mein first.
Awesome. Who is your favorite Ninja Turtle?
My favorite Ninja Turtle, I think growing up he was Donatello. I feel like lately it's Leo.
Interesting. Any reason for the switch?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I feel like Leo, I kind of just he was always the one that was sort of the blandest to me growing up. But I kind of like him in that, I guess being a parent now, I can kind of understand the crap he's got to deal with all the time because, he's the leader. He's trying to keep shit in check all the time, and Raphael is always giving him such a hard time about it.
Right.
So I guess I just sympathize with all the crap he's got to put up with. Raphael was also a favorite for a while too, and depending on how the mood strikes me, I might say Raphael, but right at this very moment, we'll say Leo.
Awesome. And what must-watch movie would you recommend to listeners?
We were just talking about this movie the other day again. There's a movie called Turbo Kid, which is a Canadian, New Zealand co-production.
All right.
It's sort of a comedy, a post-apocalyptic style comedy. It's really good, really well made, really funny. It's a bit of a lower budget affair, but I really enjoyed it a lot. And that's one film that actually kind of does have some excessive gore at points, but it's so brilliantly done that it's really enjoyable. I think that is... I know I watched something the other day that I really dug, and I'm totally blanking on what it was. But right now, Turbo Kid, if people can seek it out, it may be on Netflix. I'm not sure if it's on US Netflix or not. But if it is, set aside an hour and a half, give it a watch. It's a lot of fun.
You have been listening to Pulpcast, the official podcast of thepulpmedia.com. You can email questions that we'll answer in future episodes to thepulpmediaus@gmail.com. Also, please check out our website, thepulpmedia.com, for reviews, articles, and more.